Yeah, thank you so much, Guy. And we're joined by Mairead McGuinness, the European Commissioner for Financial Services. We have so many questions, Commissioner McGuinness, so thank you so much for joining us about banks' sanctions. And of course, if you see a lot of evasion of these sanctions through loops and ways to get around it, or whether you think a lot of the banks are actually too hard, also freezing out Russians that are not sanctions.
Well, I've been in Italy for 2 days, so I've been listening to both banks and businesses talking about what's actually happening on the ground. And there's a strong political commitment, clearly by Prime Minister Draghi, that there is full implementation. The banking sector is also fully committed, as is industry. It's interesting that there is an element of de-risking. So to your point, that some banks feel when they're not sure about an account or transaction, don't take a risk. But that's also reflected in the fact that industries that are invested in Russia are also saying, well, look, we aren't comfortable about this. We know we're not sanctioned. Maybe we should pull back from our Russian investments. The other point is around circumvention, and clearly this is something that we're very mindful of. So we're working with member states to make sure we have clear guidance, we answer questions. We're working with our allies, the US, the UK, Australia, Japan, and others. So it's a complex process because we're not just targeting the financial system, but also some trade issues as well.
So what are you seeing right now? Is it cryptocurrencies that helps?
I don't think so. I think there was a lot of talk about crypto. I wouldn't deny that something might happen there, but I don't think that's our worry. I think the worry from industry and from the banks is to make sure that they do the right thing, that they're not found wanting when it comes to circumvention, even by accident. So again, our clarification is really important, because remember, the amount of sanctions we've imposed in a short period of time is enormous, and therefore you can understand that there is a lot of engagement with countries and entities and the financial system to give clarifications.
Commissioner, it's Guy in London. Let me just continue this conversation. The Russians have a new way of paying for gas. It involves money being transferred in euros, those euros ultimately being transferred into rubles. Are you comfortable with this new procedure that Moscow is putting in place? Do you worry that it may be circumventing some of those sanctions?
Well, we've just talked about circumvention, and clearly what's happening in relation to how fossil fuel is paid for. The contracts that member states have with Russia is to pay in euros, and that is to continue, although there's been some confusing signals given around that. So around this issue, we're going to have a lot of, I suppose, comments, and maybe a lot of it is to try and confuse both those of us who are relying on Russian fossil fuel. And I think to that particular point, it's very clear, and we know from a European point of view, that we need to rapidly move away from that over-reliance, but we also insist that contracts are honoured.
So just to be clear, your advice to energy companies operating in Europe, buying Russian gas, is that this is a perfectly acceptable way of paying for that gas. As long as the money is transferred into Russia in euros, you are comfortable with this procedure?
Well, this is what the contract is. So you get gas and you pay with the currency, the euro. And there's been discussions with the member states around that. Clearly, of course, on the Russian side, you will hear their attempts to circumvent what we are trying to do. But I think you have to be very clear. The sanctions are impacting. Look at what's happening in terms of interest rates in Russia. They're over 10% at this stage. That's hurting the Russian economy and Russian business. And our sanctions will deepen as the impact deepens. So around energy, and this question arises every single day, including pressure to say we should pull back sooner. Again, to the point about what are sanctions for? They are to hurt the Russian war machine. We have to be mindful of not doing over-damaging our own economy while also pulling away as rapidly as we can from that over-reliance.
But the war machine, Commissioner, is not backing away, as far as we know. So is an oil embargo next?
Well, look, this is it's always what next. So you're hearing what we're doing now. We had no expectation that Putin was going to pull his army out because of our sanctions. The only way we can be effective is that his money, his war machine, gets diluted. And to the point, I suppose everything hinges on what happens next. And we've seen terrible things happen already. And our discussions at Commission level are looking strategically at how Europe protects itself against this threat of potential loss of supplies, but equally what's right to do for Ukraine, so that Ukrainians understand that we do stand in solidarity with them.
Commissioner, do you worry about something ugly volatility happening in the financial sector? So some big margin call in the commodity space actually impacting one of the larger banks?
Well, look, in a time of uncertainty, you have to be very mindful and watchful. And so far, in terms of the impact on our financial system, we're comfortable, that some issues arose, but we were able to deal with them. There is this big question about commodities, for example. And to this point, we really need to be careful on wheat and how we supply the global food chain. So on commodity markets, we're watchful as well. So there's many things to worry about at the moment, including to the point that you raise. But between ourselves, ECB and other regulators, we're looking very carefully. We're keeping in close contact with our member states, but we're also planning not to be in this position where we are so over-reliant, and also planning to make sure that Europe plays its full part in supplying commodities to the food chain so that we don't have problems with global hunger, which would be a horrific impact of Putin's war.